Last week, we looked at ecosystems. This week, we're looking at how you name organisms in an ecosystem. So we're looking at the study of classification. Classification is grouping organisms, and actually species of organisms, based on similarities. So for example, if I was making shapes, I could group all of the squares together and all of the triangles together. Or I could group the big shapes and the small shapes together. So that's classification. Taxonomy is grouping and naming organisms based on similarities and based on evolutionary relationships. So organisms that are more closely related through evolution are grouped together in taxonomy. A taxa is just a group. A taxon or taxa is just a group of organisms. So when you look at taxonomy and classification, you start big with big groups and you work down to smaller groups. So we start with domain. That's the biggest group. There are eukaryotes, archaeobacteria, and eubacteria. Then next we have kingdoms, like the animal and plant kingdoms and protista and fungi and archaea and eubacteria. Then we have phylum. Then we have class. Then we have order. Then we have family. Then we have genus. And we end up with species. It's important to know the definition of species. A species is a group of organisms that can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. So, if we wanted to look at the bobcat and the lynx, right in here, the species name for bobcat is L. rufus. The species name for lynx is L. canadinus. So they're different species, but they're in the same kingdom. They're both in the animal kingdom together. They're in the same phylum, Chordata, meaning they have a backbone. They're in the same class, Mammalia, meaning they're mammals. They have hair and they feed and nails and they feed their young. They're in the same order, Carnivora, meaning they're carnivores, they eat meat. They're in the same family, Felidae, which means they're cats. They're in the same genus, Lynx, okay, but they diverge or separate at species. This is the species name for a bobcat, and this is the species name for a lynx. Because they share all these other commonalities, they are very closely related through evolution and through the similarities. They look very similar to each other. So which taxon is most specific? That means the fewest number of organisms fits into them. That means if I said something like Homo sapiens, which means humans, you would say, okay, you're only talking about humans. So the species is the most specific category. The least specific category is the category that fits the most number of organisms. So for example, if I said the animal kingdom, you wouldn't necessarily know I was talking about humans. It's not as specific. Even bigger groupings and kingdoms are domains. So the least specific is domain. The taxon that's the largest and includes the most number of organisms is the domain. And the taxon that's the smallest and includes the least number of organisms is the species. So you need to know these in order from biggest to smallest. So we have domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Right? So to remember that, you can make up a sentence. So my sentence is, Dear King Philip came over for great snacks. And that helps me remember the order, because each letter represents one of the first letters of the order, right? Domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. When you name an organism, there are two parts of a name, but to name an organism we use Latin, because nobody speaks Latin anymore, so it's fair, and the language isn't going to, like, we don't pick English or Chinese or Arabic, we just use Latin, because nobody speaks that in their daily lives, right? Plus it's not going to change, because nobody speaks it. But when we name a species, a scientific name of a species is called its binomial, meaning two nomenclature. And a species name has two parts. It has the genus, and it has something called the specific epithet. So when you look at an example here, the scientific name for humans is Homo sapiens. So if you hear the word Homo sapiens, you're like, okay, that's human. Okay. Homo is the genus name. Sapiens is the specific epithet. And then the entire name is known as its scientific species name. So, we just talked about that up here. What is the species name for human, and label the name. So it's Homo sapiens, and we labeled it right up here. So I answered 1 up here. Table 2 lists several birds that I found in Virginia, and I use this example because my kids and I have been watching birds a lot. So if you get a chance, look out the window and watch some birds. These birds are found in Virginia. We need to circle the 2 that are most closely related. So let's see. Here are the names of the birds: the mockingbird, green-winged teal, bald eagle, white-tailed hawk, or mallard. And how can I tell how related they are? Well, let's look at the scientific names. Okay. All right, so I'm finding some similarities. It looks like the green-winged teal and the mallard have the same genus name. So they are very closely related at the genus. Okay, so they're most closely related to each other. So the teal and the mallard are in the same genus, so they are closely related. Okay. So why is naming organisms and classification so important? Well, for one reason, it helps you tell different species apart. So for example, this coral snake is poisonous, whereas this scarlet king snake is not poisonous. And actually, you would have to identify them by their banding patterns. So by naming them and finding out their characteristics and using the scientific naming, we can avoid poisonous snakes and be okay around non-poisonous snakes. This also is true for poison ivy. By naming it and identifying it, you can find poison ivy and Virginia creeper. Poison ivy is poisonous and gives you a rash, whereas Virginia creeper is harmless and doesn't do anything. So naming species is important when you're trying to determine what species is what. It's also important because rare medications can be found in different species, and if you find 2 closely related species, maybe both of them hold the compound to make a rare medication. That's also important for understanding evolutionary history and how organisms relate to each other. So another term I discussed was this idea of a species. Okay? I said the definition for species is a group of organisms that can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. That means that the 2 organisms can have a child and that child can have a child. And the reason I bring this up is because donkey and horses, they can have children together. Those children are called mules. But these mules cannot have children of their own. That's why we consider donkeys and horses 2 different species. Okay, so species have to be able to interbreed produce children, and their children have to be able to produce children. Here's another example. A lion and a tiger are different species. Because lions and tigers can mate and they can produce offspring, right? So this liger is a real animal. This liger is a mix between a male lion and a female tiger. But the liger is sterile. The liger cannot have children. That's why the lion and the tiger are different species. So if you can't reproduce together or your children are sterile, you're considered part of different species. So as we said, the green-winged teal and the mallard are part of the same genus, so they're most closely related. Make sure, however, you don't get confused because in this example, okay, the Mamut americanum and the Campanula americanum are not closely related. They share the same specific epithet, americanum, but they're not the same species because both names don't match and they're not the same genus, so they're not closely related. So look at the first name for a match or a perfect match. Otherwise, they're not as closely related. So the case study in your notes says, is the red wolf a separate species? Okay, the red wolf can breed and produce offspring with both the coyote and the gray wolf. These offspring cannot have offspring of their own. So the three animals have been classified as different species. Does this support the scientific definition of species? So let's think about that. Okay, does it? Well, the answer is yes, it does support the definition of species. Okay. So the red wolf can produce offspring with the coyote and with the gray wolf, but their offspring are sterile, right? So they've been classified as different species. This does support the scientific definition of species because while the red wolf can have children with the coyote and the gray wolf, those children are sterile, which means they cannot have their own children. So they are not the same species. This is part 1 of the video on classification. Please watch part 2 as well.